One video on statistics here. The rest of this I'll do in class, but I thought I'd make one video anyway. And I apologize, there's not much calculations to do here, but there's a whole lot of writing. Alright, so get your best pencil out, and here we go. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the difference between a population and a sample. You might be wondering, well, what's statistics? We'll get there in a second. First of all, I'm going to explain the difference between a population and a sample. So a population is the entire group of things being considered. It's everything that you're interested in. So an example could be the population of Canada, or the population of BC, or the population of King George Secondary students. All right, now, sample is a smaller piece of the population. It's a part of the population that you're going to collect data from. So maybe you're not going to ask everyone in Canada. Maybe you're only going to ask people in British Columbia. Or maybe you're only going to ask Canadians who are attending university. If your population is King George students, maybe your sample is just grade 10s or something like that. All right, so now you might say, well, why would you bother the sample? Why don't you just ask everybody in the whole population, and then you always get the most precise, the most exact, the most accurate data, right? The best information if we just ask everyone. Well, there's a problem with that. There's a couple problems with that. If we wanted to ask everyone in Canada, that's going to be a lot of time to do so, and it's also going to take a lot of money. Now, we do that sometimes. In fact, every 5 years, we do something called a census, and that's where we ask, or try at least as much as possible, to get a survey done for every member of the Canadian population. So as I wrote here, that takes a lot of time and it costs too much to do very often. We just do it every 5 years in Canada. So for that reason, we usually aren't sampling a whole population. In other words, we're not doing a census. We just take samples of the population. Now, if you have a small population like King George students, maybe you could ask the whole population, the whole KG population. But oftentimes we need to take a smaller amount. And this is where statistics comes into play. Statistics is the science of collecting data, analyzing data, presenting data, and interpreting data. Okay, so I'll talk about that more in a second, but first let me explain what's data. Well, data is when you're getting facts that are used to summarize information in a convenient way. Okay, this is all kind of difficult to understand, isn't it? Basically, when we go out and we take a sample, we get a bunch of data, we get a bunch of numbers, we get a bunch of information about a group of people. And statistics is where we take that data and we see, all right, now that we have this data, we've collected it in some way, we're going to analyze it now. We're going to take a look for trends and patterns and things like that. Then we're going to present it to other people and we're going to interpret it. That's kind of the why of the whole thing. Why is it that most people preferred hockey in Canada or something like that? Okay, so yeah, the tricky part with statistics is you want to make sure that you ask a sample, because you probably won't be able to ask the whole population, but you want that sample to be representative of the population, we say. We don't want it to be biased. If the sample is biased, then it's inaccurate. It doesn't match the population. And that's really tricky, to not be biased. So biased is the tendency of data that you get from a sample to overestimate or underestimate some aspect of a population. So say, for example, that you ask, you go out and you do a sample, and you ask people what their favorite sport is. You don't ask everyone in the population, and you find that 30% of people love basketball the most. And then somehow magically you're able to figure out what the real answer is for the whole population, and the real answer isn't 30%, it's 78%. Well, clearly that was a bad sample you took, because the sample isn't even close to the population. You want the sample to match the population. Now, the hard part of this is you don't usually know what the answer is for the population, but you have to work hard to make sure that the sample you take isn't biased. So the way you do that is you have to make sure you do effective sampling methods. Sampling method is the way that you go out and get your data. It's how we select members of a population to be part of a study. So again, let's think of King George students. Say that's the population, is all King George students. There's all sorts of ways we could select people to be part of a population. We could just approach people in the hallways and ask them. We could choose entire grades, like, oh, I'm only going to ask the grade 10s. Or maybe we're only going to ask girls. Or maybe we're only going to ask people who are on the basketball team. Or maybe we're going to ask 10 people from each grade. Or maybe, there's all sorts of ways we could do it. These are all called sampling methods. So here's an example of 4 sampling methods: 3 bad, 1 good. The first one that's not very good, but is pretty common to tell the truth, is convenient sampling or convenience sampling. So this is where you just ask whoever's around, right? You stand down in the foyer of the school and people come by and you're like, hey, can you answer these questions for me? And some people are like, yeah, sure. And other people are like, no, I'm sorry, I don't have time for that right now. So it's convenient, it's easy, but the problem is it's biased. How come? Well, due to the location and also to the time of day. So if we're down in the foyer asking these questions, you'd never ask me, for instance, because I almost never walk by that way. I come in from the parking lot, I go up to my room, and when I leave at the end of the day, I go out the same door. I almost never pass through the foyer. So that's not fair. Everyone needs to have an equal chance of getting asked. Also, the time of day. Let's say that you go to do this at lunchtime. You go down to the foyer at lunchtime to ask your questions. Well, that's great, except some people don't end up down there at lunchtime. Maybe they do go through the foyer in the morning to come to school, and they do go through the foyer at the end of the day to leave school, but they don't go through the foyer at lunchtime. Well, that's bias because you're not going to reach those sorts of people. Okay, second type, voluntary response sampling. This is also very common, and it's also not great. This is where you request that people respond, and people decide whether to do so or not. So let's say over the announcements one day, a teacher says, we're interested in getting your information because we're trying to plan some clubs for this year. Can you please drop off a note in Mr. Wodge's box in the office telling me which clubs that you want to be part of this year? All right, everyone got an equal chance. They all heard it. But the problem is that only people with really strong opinions usually respond to these sort of samples. Let me change the question. Let's say the question was, do you think that there's bullying in King George Secondary School? Now, people who feel strongly that, yeah, I have been bullied or whatever, they're probably very likely going to respond. So you're going to get, a lot of ones that say, yes, there's strong bullying. There's a lot of bullying at King George Secondary School. Then there might be other people who feel strongly like, oh, I'm sick and tired of people talking about bullying. There's no bullying. It doesn't happen at our school. So they also respond. The people who don't respond are the people who are like, yeah, maybe a little bit of bullying, but I'm not sure actually. Yeah, I think once I saw it. No, those people aren't responding. They're just kind of hazy in the middle. They don't respond. The people who only respond to these sort of things, these voluntary response samplings, are people with really, really strong opinions. And for that reason, it's a really biased sample. It's not indicative of the whole population. Okay, the next one I would just say is another type of voluntary response sampling. It's a television or online survey. So this is where you're watching a television program or you go on a website and it says, we'd like you to respond to this survey. So please phone in maybe, or please fill in the online survey. And the same thing happens. You're only getting people who really have strong opinions. So this is biased again. First of all, it's limited to the people watching that show or visiting that website. And the other problem is you're tending only to have people with really strong opinions. All right, well, how should we sample then? We should do it randomly. We should do it in a way that every person in the population has an equal chance of being in the sample. It doesn't matter if you're boy or girl or transgendered or gay or straight or it doesn't matter. Everyone has a chance of being in the sample, regardless of age, race, everything. Okay? So this is not biased, unless it's a very small sample. If you do this random method, but you only ask 4 people, that's not going to be very accurate probably. The more people you can ask, the closer your sample is going to be to your population, and the more accurate it's going to be. So again, with King George students, if we wanted a nice random sample, what we might do is go to the office and get a list of all the students' names in the whole school. And then we could number them all off or something. And then we could randomly get some random numbers. There's such things on the internet, random number generators. And we get, let's say, 8 random numbers, and we look up those kids, and then we go ask them questions. Now, if we just do 8 kids, it's probably not great. But if we do 50 kids, hey, well, now we got a pretty good group. We're probably getting some pretty accurate answers to our questions that we're looking for. Okay, so as much as possible, we want things to be random. Okay, there's other sources of bias. Even if you sample correctly, the way you choose members to sample, there's other things you have to watch out for. One thing is use of language. So how the question is asked could affect the answer that's given. Say, for example, I ask this question: do you agree that hockey is the most exciting sport? This is very biased. Do you know why? Because of this bit at the start here where it says, do you agree? It makes it sound like, oh gosh, I guess most people think that. Well, maybe I better agree with that because I don't want to look dumb or anything. So, yeah, I agree with that. Now, you might say, no, I wouldn't do that. But this bias can be very, very subtle. So, you have to make sure you're asking questions that are very neutral. The better question to ask instead of this might be what? How about something like, what is the most exciting sport, in your opinion? That's not bias. That's giving people an equal opportunity to answer anything, hockey or otherwise. Okay, another source of bias is time and timing. So, for example, this happens to me all the time. I get asked if I'll complete a survey to do with teaching, right? So I think, okay, I want to be a good guy. I'm going to help out. So I start answering the questions, and then I see this thing that says, you are now 3% through the survey, and I've already spent 3 minutes doing it. What? I do the math and I figure out this thing's going to take over half an hour to do. I'm sorry, I'm not doing that survey. We're all busy and a 30-minute survey isn't happening. So it's very biased because only a certain type of person is going to do a 30-minute survey. Another problem is with timing. So if I was to go around and ask students at the start of September, right when they arrive for school, hey, how much do you like school? That's not really fair to ask right at the start of September. Now, we could probably argue it both ways. There might be a lot of kids who are feeling really great. They're refreshed from summer, they're excited to see their friends and their teachers, of course, again, and so they're going to answer very positively. Then there might be others who are, really upset about losing their summer and they might say, no, I hate school. But my suspicion is if we ask people at the start of September and then asked again at the start of December, you'd have more people giving positive reviews in September than you do in December. So you have to be careful about your timing when you're asking questions. And finally, privacy. When you're asking questions that people would be reluctant to answer, that's not a great thing. So, for example, if you asked, well, let's say I went around got a random list of kids at King George, and then I went up to them and said, hey, I just had a couple questions for you. First question, who's your least favorite teacher at school? Now, first of all, if I was their least favorite school teacher, which is very possible, I know, they're probably not going to want to say that to my face. And even if I wasn't their least favorite teacher, maybe they don't want to say anyone else either. They're like, well, I don't want to tell this guy who my least favorite teacher is. He'll probably go blab in the lunchroom. Next thing I know, I'm not going to name any names, but Mr. Edwards, who I don't think we have at our school, do we? Mr. Edwards, imaginary Mr. Edwards, is going to be all grumpy at me in class and give me a bad mark. So shouldn't ask questions that are going to make people uncomfortable or make them unlikely to answer them. Okay, the last thing is ethics. So ethics is using data for purposes other than it was intended for. So if you approach people to do a survey, there's this understanding that you're going to use the information you get from them ethically. So some things that would be unethical. One, if you emailed a person and asked them on a date. So you got all this information from people. You went and asked 30 KG students, and as you're doing it, there was this one person that, wow, what a great personality and, pretty good looking too. Ah, wow, they did write down their email. I think I'll just contact them and ask if they'll go out on a date with me. No, that's completely unethical. You're not supposed to be doing stuff like that. And another example would be sending email advertisements to people who complete the survey. So you get 100 people to fill in your survey, and then you're like, hey, you know what? I'm starting that business. Maybe if I just send all those people an advertisement to my business, that could really help my business take off. That's not right. You're not supposed to do that. That wasn't the original purpose of the data you collected. All right, what's biased about the following sampling techniques? So, number one, we survey King George kids to learn about teenage drug use. Well, there's a couple things I don't like about that. One is we're only asking King George kids to give us answers, and then from there we're going to talk all about teenage drug use for in general. That's a pretty biased if we're only talking about King George kids. So I would say it's not representative of all teenagers. Or what are we talking about? Teenagers in BC? Let's say it's BC teenagers. So I would say that King George is not representative of the population. For example, I used to live in Squamish, which is a little more rural than King George, and there was a lot more drug use there than there is at King George, I think. I'm pretty sure. Now that was a little while ago, but I imagine if we went up to northern British Columbia, some small communities and stuff, there's probably more drug use in some of those places than King George. So it's not representative in that way. The other problem here, I think, is the privacy concern. Are kids really going to open up to a surveyor and be like, oh yeah, well, I use drugs a lot. The drugs I use are blah 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 blah, and here's how often I use them, and who's here I use them with. No, people aren't going to want to do that. Now, if it's an anonymous survey, maybe, but even then, some students would probably be reluctant to answer honestly. Okay, number 2, surveying a random sample of 12 kids at King George to learn about preferred genres of music. Hey, that sounds pretty good. It's a random sample. We get 12 names and we ask them what their preferred genre is. We don't say, the question's something like, what's your preferred genre of music? They can say anything they want. What's the only issue here? The 12. It's a bit of a small sample size, right? If we could increase that a little bit, maybe up to like 40 or something, that would be great. So besides the small sample size, this is looking pretty good. Okay, last one, 50. That's a pretty good number. Random, great. King George students are asked, why is math the most important subject in school? I mean, what's wrong with that? Math is the most important subject in school, right? No, that's the problem right there. This why is math the most important? The question should be, what is, in your opinion, the most important subject in school? This is a biased question. So what do we say here? The wording? Yeah, the use of language here is biased. But I think everyone would probably answer math anyway. So, all right, everyone. That's it for this strange, wordy lesson. And we'll talk more about statistics in class. Take care.